Good morning, everybody. Can you all hear me? Great. Oh, it's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces in the crowd. Buenos dias. It is an honor to be here with you all today. My name is Isabel González Whitaker, and I am the Associate Vice President of Public Engagement for Moms Clean Air Force. We at Moms Clean Air Force are so thrilled to have you here today at our inaugural Climate Disruption, Air Pollution, and Young People's Health event. It has been such an honor to meet and to learn from all of our panelists and speakers as we've worked so hard to make this morning happen. I'd like to give special thanks to the Administrator of the EPA, Michael Regan, Vice Chair of the Clinton Foundation, Chelsea Clinton, and the Chair of the President's Council on Environmental Quality, Brenda Mallory, for joining us today. Thanks to all these participants, we are all going to leave this event in a few hours informed and more inspired. Okay, I'm here actually with the housekeeping notes. So as a reminder, this is being live streamed, so please keep your phones on silent and be mindful of moving around so as not to block the cameras. For awareness, we want everybody to note that the exit doors, there's one on the left behind you and there's one on the right behind you. Be sure to check out the program via the QR code on the back of your badge and note that the program ends promptly at 11 a.m. We'd love for you to continue the conversation online, tag Moms Clean Air Force, and hashtag Moms Climate Summit. Okay, so on with the program, starting with our very special and very dynamic speaker. I am delighted to introduce you all to somebody I know you all are going to fall in love with. And she is one of the members of our Kids Clean Air Force program, Lena Lazo. Welcome to the stage, Lena.
Hi, I'm Lena. I'm a fifth grader from Virginia Beach, Virginia. My stepmom, Liz Hurtado, works for Moms Clean Air Force and Eco Madres. She inspires me every day because she works really hard to protect us all from air pollution and climate change. I'm excited to be here with her and all of you fighting for kids like me and for our futures. Right now, I'm here to introduce a video that shows the work my stepmom does and what all people who are part of Moms Clean Air Force do as they work to make sure all kids have access to the cleanest air possible. Please watch and enjoy.
Meet some of the more than 1.5 million members of Moms Clean Air Force who are united in taking action to protect clean air and children's health. Founded in 2011, we are the largest and most influential climate and clean air movement led by moms, dads, and caregivers. In 2017, we launched our Latino community outreach program, Eco Madres. We connect science and data with real people. We make clear why everyone should care about climate disruption, air pollution, toxic chemicals, including petrochemicals, how they harm our bodies and our minds, why they are so dangerous. We demand action and justice in every breath. We open doors at every level of government and agencies such as the Environmental Protection Agency so they can hear from our members. We are highly effective. We have field organizers and members in states across the country. Together, we are securing vital health protections for families everywhere through persistent action, including thousands of messages to Congress and regulatory agencies, hundreds of public hearings, press conferences, congressional office visits, community engagement, media outreach, and more. We tell Washington, listen to your mothers, and they are listening. More importantly, they are acting. We have made amazing progress in our fight, but we have more to do. Our work is never done. Protections aren't strong enough until every family is safe. Moms Clean Air Force mobilizes parents and caregivers using the most precious and renewable resource of all, love. Moms will do everything to keep children safe, and we are uniting to take action that ensures a better future for everyone. Join us.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for getting out here this morning. Mom's Clean Air Force was born out of one of those magical mind meld conversations that are rare but life-altering and certainly career-altering. One of those conversations where it's impossible to tease out who said what and who had what idea because they were coming in such a rush. 13 years ago, my friend Sue Mandel, an EDF board member, and I were talking about how frustrating it was to get anything done on the climate front. Why not mobilize mothers who are fierce protectors of their children to tackle the climate crisis? We needed to change the climate conversation from polar bears to people. And so together, we founded and launched Mom's Clean Air Force. We began joining mothers from around the country, taking them through those huge, intimidating doors to the halls of Congress, EPA, and governor's offices. I will never forget climbing the granite stairs to a Senate building with a group of mothers for their first-time visit to DC. One mom froze at the threshold, and she turned to me with a stricken look and said, "Are you sure this is legal?" Thousands of meetings, marches, petitions, gatherings, and testimonies later, we are in a period of enormous and vital progress. In the last 2 years, Congress passed and President Biden signed into law significant historic investments in clean, renewable energy, in clean transportation, and in finding and cleaning up those leaking and abandoned gas wells. Wells that are in people's backyards, in their playgrounds, and in parks. Moms fought hard for those laws. With Administrator Regan's leadership, EPA is tackling deadly pollution from our transportation systems, from our energy systems, and next, we expect, from a burgeoning petrochemical and plastics industry. From the President's office and throughout the administration, children's health and justice for all children has been moved to the center of the conversation. Babies, children, and young adults have unique vulnerabilities to air pollution, to climate disruption, and to toxic chemicals. Mothers are learning, as scientists are learning, more about children's developing brains, their developing psyches, their hearts, their lungs, and their hormone or endocrine systems. We've learned that barriers we once thought were impenetrable, placental barriers, blood-brain barriers, are more porous than we knew. We've learned about how truly terrible are many of the chemicals in our air and in the stuff we use every single day. Sperm counts are plummeting. Cancer rates among young people are rising, especially young women. It's outrageous. Everything we learn makes us determined to fight harder. Are we done? Not by miles. We're moms. Nothing is ever good enough, right? Every year, the damage and disruption done by big polluters is more apparent and more terrifying. The opposition to progress is not to be underestimated. But we believe in celebrating all progress too, all hard-won achievements whenever we can. The progress we're making in the last few years give us hope. I'm honored to be here today with some of the strongest champions for children's health, some of the people who have taught us so much about children's special vulnerabilities. You'll hear from people who have devoted decades of their lives to fighting for clean air, and from a new generation of leaders who understand how vital it is to protect young people's physical and mental well-being. Mom's Clean Air Force has always had at its beating heart a core value: love. We want to remind people in every petition, every EPA testimony, every congressional meeting with lawmakers, that we are not demanding change because of what is at risk with climate, chemical, and air pollution. Our work is about who is at risk. Who is at risk? All those we hold dear. Our children, our nieces, our nephews, our grandchildren. And yes, the polar bears too. Thank you for joining us today. It's now my pleasure to introduce Paul Billings of the American Lung Association. We're going to have a little conversation. The ALA was founded in 1904. That's 120 years of explaining to people the connections between dirty air, toxic chemicals, and lung health. The nonpartisan ALA has been a crucial resource to all of us by making a health-based case for clean air, one grounded in science. Billings has led advocacy efforts to clean up air pollution from motor vehicles, cut toxic mercury emissions from power plants, curb methane, carbon, and other pollution driving climate change, and strengthen the health-based ambient air quality standards. The American Lung Association's annual State of the Air report has made headlines for nearly 25 years. Please welcome Paul Billings, Senior Vice President, Public Policy at ALA. He's been an invaluable partner for all of us. Paul, you've been a devoted champion of clean air for decades, 3 decades, right, at ALA. You've done so much to help people connect the dots. I was delighted to learn recently that this is sort of a family calling, actually, and you grew up with this fight. So will you take a few moments to tell us about your father's work on the Clean Air Act?
Thanks, Dominique, and thanks, Mom's Clean Air Force, for having me here today. The Clean Air Act is my family business. My dad went to work for Senator Ed Muskie, the author of the Clean Air Act, in 1966, and was the lead staffer on the 1970 Act. A public health law that really has changed the world, and millions of people live longer, healthier lives because of that. And so, I remember a little bit about my dad not being home a lot during that time period, though the Senate was a much more civil place, and it was a bipartisan law that he partnered with Howard Baker from Tennessee, a Republican, to really champion clean air. And the result was both the 70 Act and the 77 amendments that my dad worked so closely on passed with overwhelming bipartisan majorities. And fast forward a few years, I got out of college, wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, and I landed with the National Clean Air Coalition, which was an umbrella lobby that the Lung Association was a part of, Environmental Defense Fund was a part of, and a lot of other consumer, union, faith, environmental health organizations were a part of, and helped the 1990 Act passed. And then, for the last 33 years, I've been defending Ed Muskie's legacy of clean air and healthier lungs for everyone.
It's such an inspiring story, and I'm sure you learned a lot from your father. Okay, teaser alert. I know you have an upcoming report from ALA about children's health and air and climate. Without scooping yourself, can you tell us a bit about this report and what inspired you and your team to work on it?
We've been working really hard for the last several years to try to get EPA to finalize strong trucks rules and cars rules to really speed the transition to zero-emission transportation, running on a clean electricity grid. And so this is the 4th report in our series looking at the benefits of that cleaner transportation and a clean grid. So we're going to look at the health benefits, because we know that children are much more vulnerable to air pollution. And we know that people who live and work near roadways experience much greater health burdens. There's a large and growing body of research. So this report really tries to capture what those benefits would be if we can really accelerate that transition to zero emission. We know that the future is zero emission, and we hope that this report will help bolster the case to get those rules across the finish line and talk to everyone about how important it is to protect our most vulnerable, our children whose lungs are still developing and can benefit so much from cleaner air.
Thank you, Paul. Tell us a little bit about what's the hardest part of this fight for you.
what's the hardest part of this fight? I think the hardest part of this fight is to try to make sure that we're continuing to make forward progress when we get knocked down. You know, we had a really hard challenge a few years ago when we had a very hostile administration that was trying to undo decades of progress. You know, when I started in this work, I worked on the 1990 amendments, bipartisan. You know, Mitch McConnell voted for the Clean Air Act in 1990. Jim Inhofe, the famous guy that threw the snowball on the floor of the United States Senate, he was in the House, he voted for the Clean Air Act. It was a bipartisan value. And what we've seen is we've become much more polarized, and we've seen the pendulum swing back and forth. You know, we at the Lung Association think that everyone has lungs, and lung health should be something everyone supports, regardless of how you register to vote. And so that's, I think it's really hard, is to continue to make progress and help people understand the enormous benefits that can be derived from fully enforcing the Clean Air Act.
Do you have ideas about how you speak to people who seem just intransigent?
Well, I think you try to meet people where they are. One of the things I think is a great strength of Moms Clean Air Force is, you know, that we all want to listen to our moms. And, you know, most of us, though I do question some people in this town, care about children. And so I think talking about, you know, shared values, finding that commonality, and making that connection. And then we, you know, look through a health lens. And we think everyone has an opportunity to live a longer, healthier life. And, you know, I've yet to meet somebody outside of perhaps the halls of Congress who thinks the air is too clean or thinks that they are too healthy. So I think there's an opportunity there to build that connection.
And how do you talk about climate change?
Well, we look at climate change as a health issue as well. We're seeing the impacts. We're all experiencing the impacts of climate change today. I think it was really brought home to those of us in the eastern two-thirds of the United States this summer when we experienced the impacts of the catastrophic wildfires across the border in Canada. We woke up to days with, you know, extremely hazardous air quality, you know, code maroon days. I never thought I would see that in Montgomery County, Maryland, where I grew up and where I live today. You know, it was more of an abstraction that our friends on the West Coast in California, Oregon, and Washington and Montana have been experiencing for more than a decade. But I think that really drove it home. And so really looking at climate change as a health issue and the health benefits, and also understanding that you know, we can make a difference. It's not a problem that can't be solved. I think that, you know, too many people say, oh, you know, the die is cast. No, we can make a difference. The policies we support, the policies we enact, and the behaviors we also change in our own lives.
You know, I get very frustrated when I see all these headlines about giant umbrellas in the sky and, so, you know, stations on other planets, when actually it's much cheaper to cut the pollution.
Well, I think that's always true, right? Prevention is always cheaper than trying to do something after the fact. And we can cut the pollution. We know what the solutions are. What we need to do is muster the will. And I think events like today, organizations like Moms Clean Air Force, I think, you know, and tapping into, you know, mama bear energy, protecting those cubs. But I'm thinking about human mama bears, not those polar bears you were talking about. I think that's an opportunity as well.
Thank you for the ad. We'll take it. You know, I was thinking about your father and you and your experience growing up, because you were really raised with a model of somebody who took action and engaged in changing the system. And how do you talk to young people who are coming into ALA, who want to work with you, and who are children? You know, they grew up as children hearing about climate disruption, and they've been experiencing it, and it's frightening. How do you talk about these things?
Well, I think that is a challenge. I think that, you know, we're in the hope business at the American Lung Association. I think really it's instilling a sense of hope, whether it's hope for someone who's been diagnosed with lung cancer, someone who has a child who has severe asthma, who's in and out of emergency rooms and hospital visits, or talking to young people about climate change. You know, despair can be paralyzing, but action is empowering. And so we need to translate that despair into hope, and that inaction into policy change.
My sister's a school teacher in Kentucky and taught for 30 years, and she said over the course of her career, the number of children who came to school with their inhalers and instructions for what to do has just skyrocketed. Even though the air is actually getting cleaner, right?
Yeah, we've made tremendous progress. I mean, one of the great legacies of the Clean Air Act is that the air is much cleaner today in most parts of the country. In our State of the Air report, for the first 16, 17 years of the report, we saw really steady declines. And then we saw, over the last 6, 7 years, upticks, which we attribute to climate change, creating more conditions for ozone formation, the wildfires we talked about. And certainly, we have seen, anecdotally, we hear a lot about these stories about, as my wife was a teacher, taught 5th grade for many, many years. I was a soccer coach. I remember having the kids we had to watch because of their asthma. So certainly we understand that the health threats are real, but also, to me, it means we need to redouble our efforts. The fact that the air was much dirtier when I was born and my dad was working on the 1970 Clean Air Act, and it's cleaner today, I take some comfort in, but the fact that my kids, the air is still not safe and healthy for them to breathe, that's not good enough. And I think that's one of the challenges we have with the Clean Air Act. Well, we've seen progress. The progress has not been enjoyed equally or equitably. And we know that far too many communities, particularly low-income communities and communities of color, bear a greatly disproportionate burden of air pollution. And that's due to a lot of factors, including systemic racism. And so one of the things we all need to do is focus the effort on those that are bearing the greatest burden. If that is our North Star, if we focus on the communities and the individuals that are breathing the dirtiest air, if we work to double down to protect them more, we all will benefit. And unfortunately, too many of these communities have been left behind. And so that's something I'm trying to work on, at this point in my career with these regs that we're bending at EPA.
Thank you. To close out, will you talk a little bit about what you see are your biggest goals in the next year and in the next 5 years?
Well, certainly over the next 3 or 4 months, we've got a big to-do list at EPA, and hopefully Michael Regan will talk about this a little bit later today, but there are rules on cars and trucks that have to get across the finish line that are going to accelerate that transition to zero emission. There are big rules pending on power plants. Mom's Clean Air Force was very instrumental in working on the mercury and toxic standards. We have a big rule to address toxic pollution from power plants, to update that rule. Critical, and I'm hoping that that's going to get done by March. And then another power plant rule to deal with the climate change that's driven by power plants. And then there's a whole list of other rules on toxics, but those are the big 4 rules we're working on that are so critical to get done, as well as continuing to support the state of California's efforts to regulate mobile sources and get those waivers done from EPA. So it's a big to-do list, and frankly, there's not a lot of time, and I wish more progress had been made in the previous 3+ years. But now it's crunch time, and so we can't go back in time and do more then. We've got to get it done now. Next 5 years, there's still more to be done. Yesterday EPA announced updates to the particulate matter ambient air quality standards. Big step forward, a lot more to do, and we certainly wanted a stronger standard for both the annual and daily particulate matter standard. Ozone, the most widespread pollutant in the country, that review has to get done, and has to get done it's supposed to be done by December of 2025. I don't think we're going to make that deadline, but we're going to try. But we certainly have to get that done to tell the public the truth about the air they're breathing and to finalize the rule. And then we need to do more on climate. We can't rest on the progress that's been made through the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act and the regulations that have been adopted or will be adopted in the next 2 or 3 months. We need to finish the job, which is to really transition to a zero-emission energy economy. I hope we'll get there, but I'm an optimist. That's why I do this work. But when you can't breathe, nothing else matters.
Thank you so much for your leadership and for your partnership. We so love working with you. So thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
I'm going to introduce our first panel. We have enormous challenges ahead of us. We're in a time of extremely complicated swings, politically and judicially. We have never felt greater urgency to get things done. And across the country, people are feeling and seeing the danger signs of a destabilizing climate. As I said before, Mom's Clean Air Force is focused on who is at risk in these times of intensifying disruption and in the face of everything we're learning about the toxicity and impacts of the chemicals we use every day and the air we breathe. Mom's Clean Air Force is a multi-generational effort and has been from the start. We work with new mothers who barely have time to sign a petition. We work with grandmothers like me and Sue now, who want to devote our working time left to this cause. Our first panel moderator, Osasenaga Idahor, is one of the most inspiring young adults I have ever met. And I'm counting my children, too. Osasenaga from Hyde Park, Boston, is a junior at Harvard. He's studying environmental science and public policy. He's also a pre-med student. And if that's not enough, he's also the producer and host of the podcast, The Climate Doctor, No MD, a podcast he started 2 years ago to learn more about the ways urban health is affected by environmental hazards. Osasenaga was also recently selected to join EPA Administrator Regan's inaugural National Environmental Youth Advisory Council. I met Osasenaga last year when he took an internship with Mom's Clean Air Force. During his time with Moms, Osasenaga produced and hosted a podcast on climate change, petrochemicals, and health. Welcome, Osasenaga, and take it away. It's wonderful to see you again.
Well, thank you, Dominique, for that.
I'll help you.
Yeah, that's good. Well, thank you, Dominique, for that introduction. I'm honored to introduce our distinguished panelists for this first panel. First, we have Dr. Lise Patel, the Executive Director for the Medical Society Consortium on Climate Health and Clinical Associate Professor of Pediatrics at Stanford. Judith Enck, President of Beyond Plastics, the former Regional Administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and a professor at Bennington College, and Nsedu Obot Witherspoon, Executive Director for the Children's Environmental Health Network. For the next 40 minutes, we're going to dive deep into the challenges we face when it comes to air pollution, young people's physical and mental health, and climate disruption. It's critical that we have a thorough understanding of what we are facing when it comes to climate disruption and air pollution, and who is most impacted by it, so that we can have a thorough foundation of the solutions, so we can have a thorough foundation for the solutions that we're working towards, that young people and future generations deserve. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome my panelists to the stage. Thank you, Dominique, for the introduction. Yeah, my name is Osasenaga. I'm from Hyde Park in Boston, and growing up, I was introduced to the idea of environmental injustice in school, because even though I saw the hazards in my community, it wasn't until I went to a school in a predominantly in a more affluent area that I saw that I didn't have to accept the status quo when it came to environmental hazards in my community. And so as a young person who's really interested in understanding solutions that also involve ways we can improve the physical and mental health of young people, I mean, I'm excited for what our panelists are gonna teach us, and I hope you guys are too. So without further ado, I'm gonna start, and we're gonna have this first question for Dr. Lise Patel. Lisa, you're a pediatrician who works every day at the intersection of climate change and young people's health. Why are young people in particular so vulnerable to the impacts of climate disruption and air pollution?
That's a great question. And so it gets to the fact that, and I think Paul talked a little bit about this, that children are developing rapidly in the beginning. So particularly their lungs, their brain, their heart, their immune system, these things are rapidly growing in a developing child. And so when they're exposed to these toxins, they're more vulnerable because of that development. Children also spend more time outdoors, so they will be exposed more to these toxins. They breathe faster, pound for pound. They are breathing more of those toxins in. And then finally, they don't often have the ability to adapt the way we might. You know, they really rely upon adults. So if it's a hot classroom, or we should never leave a child in a hot car, but in a hot car or overbundled child, all these things are risk factors for children in terms of climate change, and they can't always adapt to those threats.
Yeah, we also know that climate disruption and air pollution are affecting the experience of pregnancy and birth. And so, Lisa, can you talk a little bit about the impact of things like heat and air pollution on pregnancy, and who is most impacted?
Yeah, and that, so I'm a pediatric hospitalist. I work at a small community hospital in Pleasanton, California. And my experience on the ground, I've now worked during 2 heat waves, and they were 2 or 3 of the busiest shifts I've had, and this is counting going through the pandemic. And so we know from the evidence that both heat and wildfire are drivers for what we call adverse birth outcomes. So this includes premature birth, low birth weight infants, and there's emerging evidence for stillbirth in the case of wildfire smoke in particular. Now, my job as a pediatric hospitalist is when a pregnant individual comes in premature labor, I have to go in and talk to this individual about what they're facing in terms of having a premature infant. And these can be lifelong medical conditions that an infant or a child will face from being born early or being born low weight. And they always ask me, is it my fault? Is it something I did? And I say, no, of course not. And I've started to integrate climate change into what I say are the risk factors, because we do live in a place with things like heat and wildfire that drive these outcomes.
And one important part of this is the discussion of environmental health disparities or hazards. And so for that, I want to turn to Nse. Nse, you know, you're the executive director for the Children's Environmental Health Network, and you've worked for over 2 decades on reducing children's exposure to various kinds of environmental health or environmental hazards. And you've also been deeply engaged working with Black, Indigenous people and Latino and people of color communities, specifically with understanding how we can intertwine, or we can understand the connection between environmental injustice, climate disruption, and air pollution. So Nse, could you actually talk just more about that, the connection between climate disruption, air pollution, and environmental injustice?
Yeah, we've got how long? No, I'm just kidding. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure, and it's always a pleasure to be here with Moms Clean Air Force and American Lung Association, amazing partners in this very important, urgent work. I'll first start with just the reality of my probably most important job, which is mom to 4 children, 20 to 7. So I take that role extremely passionately, and of course I have a personal passion for this work, because as far as I'm concerned, no child should be born pre-polluted, which is the situation that we are looking at. Every child is born pre-polluted. So if that's not already creating a channel and a trajectory for challenge of rest of life, as we know how important our health is, I don't know what is. Excuse me. And then we know that 1 in 4 children deaths globally before age 5 are related to polluted environments. So it's like you keep stacking these realities against our children. I mean, no wonder they have the anxiety and the stress that they have, that my own children have. The reality, too, is that we are not polluted equally. So Black, brown, tribal, indigenous children, it is fact, lived experience, but also we have report upon report to validate that usually these communities are found in places, or I should say industry practices are found in places where you have predominant communities of color. And so then you see the ripple effect of the negative health outcomes, social, mental health disarray, the disarray of social fabric and disinvestment that then, again, before we even get into school and education and learning, already again sets a huge trajectory that is almost unachievable in many regards. So the report, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, was commissioned by the United Church of Christ in 1987. It's been over 30 years, and again, it was one of the first reports to document for all of us what we know has been happening, which is, again, if you look at where most of the hazardous polluting facilities are, they are congregated around communities that are already disenfranchised on many levels. And there have been numerous reports coming out after that have, again, just validated. So even in the year 2024, we still have not come out of that saga of our, I think, dark part of our history. So how did we get here? Redlining of our housing practices. Again, a range of disinvestment, I would say intentional. We even have, food apartheid, I would call it, not just food deserts. I mean, if you set up communities to fail, it's kind of hard to really find the success that children have the right to at least start to achieve. So that's one layer. And then we think about the air pollution. So you have to consider air pollution in both the indoor and the outdoor. That's very important when we look at our strategies. So outdoor, as Paul definitely showed well, is, our vehicle emissions are huge when it comes to the impact of children. I work on a lot of cancer prevention work in childhood realms in development, and we know that vehicle air pollutants are directly linked, along with other pollutants and toxins, to certain forms of childhood cancer, not to mention exacerbating our asthma, respiratory issues. And it is phenomenal to even consider that otherwise healthy children can now have onset of asthma and respiratory issues by, again, spending time living, going to school, maybe even future work by high thoroughfare situations. So that's just unacceptable. And then our outdoor air certainly can come indoor. So indoor air has its own range of challenges. So the furniture, the flooring, the products, the toys that children are playing with, and pesticides and cleaners, and many ranges of other exposure pathways. So that's the second layer of atrocity, I would say. And then we have climate implications on top of that, which exacerbate all the above. And again, not in an equal way. I might say that there might be no broader issue when it comes to children's environmental health as far as an umbrella issue than climate change, because it exacerbates all the inequities and all the other experiences that children are facing. And again, the inequity is there. If you are Latino, Latina, you are probably twice as more likely to live in a wildfire zone. If you are a person of color and you've been able to live through a natural disaster and dealing with all the trauma of that, you are $29,000 less wealthy in your personal wealth by going through that trauma. White families, unfortunately, are about $169,000 wealthier. So even before, during, and after a natural disaster, we still have the disparities that are plaguing our families.
Thank you so much, Nse, for that just wonderful background and context for exactly what we're talking about. We mean environmental injustice. And you were already getting into it, but the discussion of the built environment, inside versus external, or the open environmental pollution, particularly with children, even in school and in childcare settings. In 2022, you co-authored a report with your colleague Jacqueline Patterson on the racism that upends the cradle, Black children caught in the syndemic crosshairs. And one of the things you discussed in the report was environmental injustice when it comes to hazards at school and in childcare settings. So could you please just talk a little bit more about that for our audience?
Thank you. I mean, this is critical. If we're not protecting children where they spend the most time, then we're really missing the opportunity here. So this report that I wrote with my friend Jackie Patterson during the height of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, was a very emotional one. And we had to kind of go through that, right? And we end that report with a range of strategies and efforts and wonderful community-based efforts that are happening that need to be leveraged. So I will just start with that. There are some great programs that we're a part of, many of us here are a part of in the audience, that are working, but they need to be leveraged, they need more capacity, they need more attention and funding to model. But when we think about where kids spend the majority of their time, in the US, about 13 million or so children are entering childcare, anywhere from 6 weeks to 5 years of age. So most cognitive learning is still, and development is still happening very much even after birth. The lungs are still developing, the brain is still developing. So these are very critical windows of exposure. So not intentionally, but our centers are not equipped for this. And so, we started a program called the Eco-Healthy Childcare Program over 13, 14 years ago because we saw this gap. Childcare licensing happens differently at every state, which already makes it challenging. And they do a great job on injury prevention and fire safety and those type of exposures, but there's no mandate whatsoever in the places where children spend the most time at their cognitive learning developmental years of the air quality. What about lead? What about radon? What about these other exposures? And what about energy efficiency and other climate adaptation and resilient practices? Most childcare are in homes. So you have the dual benefit of the family benefiting when practices are achieved, healthier, safer practices, and the small business. And women predominate the early learning culture, right? It's mostly predominated by women, this profession, and mostly women of color. Many are women of childbearing age. So again, you see the benefit of, by us cleaning up these environments for current and future generations. Moving to our schools, a lot of the same exposure pathways we see in homes and childcare we see in our K through 12 schools. So ventilation, again, the height of the COVID pandemic showed us clearly, if we didn't know before, our schools are really having a hard time when it comes to just adequate ventilation on a regular day, not even when we have a worldwide pandemic going on. And keeping up with the resilience and climate adaptation and increased humidity and heat index and mold and mildew and on and on and on. Children have a hard time, I know I have a hard time focusing if I'm hot and I don't have the ability to have air conditioning, right? So there are these whole ripple effects that our schools are also dealing with. The General Accounting Office every couple of years comes out with a report that also documents this. At least 50% of our public schools are in bad shape. So we need to do better for the places where our kids are supposed to go for learning and making sure that they're not getting sick there.
Again, thank you so much. And one environmental hazard that we haven't really talked about, but we definitely need to, is plastic. Judith, as the president of Beyond Plastics, please just let our audience know, what do plastics have to do at all with climate disruption and air pollution, and what should they know about the connection between plastic and young people's health?
Sure. But first, I want to thank moms for legally prohibiting us from doing PowerPoints. This is a much better format, and I'm already so inspired by the comments this morning. Plastics is a huge issue. It's an environmental justice issue, it's a health issue, it's a recycling failure, and it's a climate change issue, and here's why. We've all been working so hard to shut down coal plants, to transition finally to clean renewable energy like geothermal, solar, wind. Well, I've got a little bit of bad news. Plastics is plan B for the fossil fuel industry. They know that they're losing money from their markets to sell transportation fuels, power plant fuels, and so these little mom and pop companies like Exxon and Shell have decided to invest billions of not only their dollars, but our tax dollars in building a massive new petrochemical infrastructure, a lot of that for plastic production. I just returned from Port Arthur, Texas, which I urge all of you, if you're ever near Houston, just go 2 hours east and look at the massive petrochemical build-out going on there. And you know, what's so disheartening is the concentration of these facilities, many of them to produce new plastics, and how people live on the fence line. So when we're talking about children's health, my first priority is children living in these predominantly environmental justice communities where this petrochemical build-out is happening. And then you broaden the scale, and it's all of our children that are exposed to plastics in a different way. It's one exposure if you're living next to a Shell ethane cracker in Pennsylvania or an Exxon chemical recycling facility in Baytown, Houston. But all of us have microplastics in our bodies. And I want to kind of zip in on that just a little bit. Microplastics are 5 millimeters or less. Nanoplastics are even smaller. When scientists look for microplastics, they find them everywhere. Microplastics are in drinking water, they're in air, they're in soil. Bad news, microplastics are in beer. Microplastics are in honey. Microplastics have now been identified in peer-reviewed scientific articles to be present in human lungs, in blood, in breast milk, and the human placenta. Dr. Ragusa from University of Rome did a study for the first time documenting microplastics in the placenta on both the fetal side and the maternal side. So as was said, our kids are being born pre-polluted. What these microplastics are doing to our health, we don't entirely know. I'm willing to go out on a limb and say it's nothing good. And I think medical researchers are pulling the curtain back on these non-biodegradable materials. Back to your first question on climate, we issued a report in 2021, the New Coal, Plastics, and Climate Change. By 2030, there will be more greenhouse gas emissions from the production, use, and disposal of plastics than from coal plants in the United States. So it has taken us decades to finally get most of the coal plants, at least in the US, shut down. We're now going to be replacing all of those greenhouse gas emissions from the production, use, and transportation of plastics. We just passed the 1-year anniversary last Saturday of the East Palestine toxic train derailment disaster. The 5 train cars that were purposely put on fire in that toxic train derailment were carrying vinyl chloride. Over 99% of vinyl chloride is used to make PVC plastic. So we have to add the transportation of all of these toxic chemicals to the growing problem profile with plastics. At some point, I will tell you the good news, but that's the overview.
Thank you so much, Judith. And you were already talking about it, but I would love it if you could go a little bit more in detail about who is the most impacted by plastic and petrochemical pollution.
The most impacted community is people living near these petrochemical and plastic production facilities. And it's mostly environmental justice communities. It is the classic example of your zip code dictates your health outcomes. But also people who eat a lot of seafood. There's a lot of microplastics in seafood, especially shrimp, mussels, oysters. I'm just filled with good news here. Any seafood you eat whole, there's likely microplastics in it. Scientists are telling us that within the next 3 to 4 years, unless we change the status quo, for every 3 pounds of fish in the ocean, there will be 1 pound of plastic. And by 2050, it's going to be 1 to 1. And fish from the ocean is a major source of protein for many people around the world. But that's only if it's the status quo. And the status quo is changing. So my biggest concerns are people living near petrochemical facilities, and then all of us who are being exposed to microplastics in our own bodies.
Thank you again, Judith, for letting us know the bad news, because we need to know it so that we can understand just what we're facing. That's what this panel is all about. So I actually have now a round of questions for our panelists about the next steps for us to address these issues. And I'm going to start with Lisa, and we'll go to Nse and to Judith. Lisa, what are other pediatricians seeing in their offices when it comes to climate disruption and air pollution? And what should parents know about how they can keep their children safe?
Yeah, as we consider the range of health impacts on children, we talked a little bit about heat waves. Heat is already the #1 weather-related killer. If carbon emissions go unabated, we can expect more deaths from heat than all infectious diseases combined by the end of the century. And I don't think any of us imagined that we would see heat waves play out this soon. And I think 2023 should have been a sobering moment for all of us in terms of how many places are being affected by extreme heat. In terms of children and how they're affected, newborns in particular, in the first week of life, there's a higher risk of mortality for newborns during a heat wave. I've treated a number of infants now who came in severely dehydrated. Either they lived in an apartment where they didn't have air conditioning, or the parents thought that they should be giving them water during a heat wave. We see more athletes coming in. I've treated an outdoor worker who was hauling brick in 108-degree weather and ended up with kidney damage. And we know that the effects of heat are particularly severe for those that work outdoors, and there are not nearly enough protections in place. Air pollution, so we know that burning of fossil fuels results in PM 2.5 pollution. To Nse's point about pre-polluted, that particulate pollution is so small. We breathe it in, it enters our lungs, our blood vessels, and basically causes inflammation. And we now have found evidence of that pollution in a developing fetus's brain, lungs, and liver. So before a child is even drawn first breath, they are already polluted from fossil fuel pollution. That pollution results in a host of issues: premature mortality, certain types of lung cancer, asthma, and cardiovascular diseases as well. And when we burn fossil fuels, not only does it foul our air, it also drives climate change, which makes things like wildfires worse. I've become an expert on wildfires, not because I wanted to, but because I live in California, Northern California, with 2 young children. And we know from the evidence that wildfire smoke is more toxic than regular air pollution. Some of the studies are showing up to 10 times more toxic. So during periods of wildfire smoke, we're seeing more children come in with asthma, bronchitis, and episodes of pneumonia. And then the mental health effects, and I think Dr. Van Susteren will be talking about this later. We cannot talk about a child in 2024 or youth without talking about the mental health crisis that our youth are experiencing, and climate change stands to make it worse. So whether we're talking about children who have been displaced, who we understand children need stable, safe, nurturing environments to thrive, and climate change stands to disrupt it. We've seen that in Katrina, in terms of those children who developed PTSD, depression, and anxiety. I've worked with the school psychologist in Sonoma who says that children will cry when they so much as see smoke in the sky. The repeated evacuations have been that devastating. And we're just seeing more and more children who are presenting with climate anxiety or eco-anxiety symptoms. And we have a healthcare workforce who doesn't always understand that actually their feelings are normal in the face of what we're facing. It is not abnormal to feel anxious about this world that we're facing that is changing so rapidly and changing in a way that's destructive to their health. So that's just a small menu of some of the health impacts that we're seeing in terms of pediatricians in their clinical practice.
And thank you for that wonderful plug for our next conversation with Dr. Lise Van Susteren, because as we talk about all of this, there are clear mental health effects to it, and it's a thing that you have to deal with, and then you have to turn that, hopefully that despair into action, as Paul Billings was talking about. So my next question is now for Nse. Why are child-centered policies for climate adaptation and mitigation so necessary right now? And what changes do we need to see in the upcoming years to protect our children's health?
You're speaking my language because, again, if we're just spinning our wheels, I would make the case that, look at all the negative health outcomes for children. I think that speaks for itself. I usually have a slide when I use them that shows we're going in the wrong way. And that's even with vested interest and the work of incredible groups and more investments from the Biden administration, Obama administration, other administrations. The bottom line is our strategy is not working. And our kids are telling us this. And now we have climate implications on top of that. So I don't know how more, well, it can get more desperate, but how long are we willing to wait? How many more lives? How many more polluted children, right? So I would make the case that we have never yet tried this experiment of putting the needs of children, as Paul was saying, and all the rest of our vulnerable populations first. The needs, what can they sustain? Ideally, it's zero emission across the board. And until we get there, what can that young developing child sustain that is truly not going to change the whole life work of their brain and their respiratory system and their organs, for the rest of their childhood and early adult and adult years. So I would make the case that we need to turn this whole thing on its head and truly put and we have an executive order, by the way, on children's environmental health that is supposed to be implementing these type of strategies. Taking a step back anytime we're putting together standards, policies, public health recommendations, and making sure that people who understand those nuances are in the room. Because I will say, for example, we have climate adaptation and climate action policies at state and local levels, but we did a survey a couple years ago, and some of them didn't even articulate the words children in them. I know for a fact that when these policies are developed and you don't have a combined multiple array of experienced leaders in that room, including impacted families, you're gonna miss a few things like that, right? If you're not even in the plan, then guess what? You're gonna be missed when those plans have to be activated. So we need to truly think about some federal strategies, because we don't really have a federal strategy that truly puts children first when it comes to environmental exposures. We do have elements in our water laws and some of our air laws and drinking water, and that's a nice step, but those are very old laws. We've known a lot more. We have a lot of science to work on. We need to mobilize for these child protective policies at the state and the national level that are putting children first.
Thank you. And lastly, for Judith, what should the Biden administration do about plastics?
I love this question so much. First, we want to ban vinyl chloride. Vinyl chloride was designated a human carcinogen 50 years ago, 5-0. And it is still with us. It's 99% of vinyl chloride is used to make PVC plastic. There are alternatives for all of the uses. PVC plastic is used to make drinking water pipes. So in the IRA, there's thankfully $10 billion for EPA to give out to state and local governments to reduce lead service lines. But they should not be replacing the lead service lines with PVC plastic pipes. And unfortunately, the EPA has not weighed in on that. It would be helpful if they did. In December, EPA announced that vinyl chloride will be part of their reevaluation of chemicals under TSCA. So that was a really, really good announcement by the EPA, and we congratulate EPA on that. But that's the beginning of like a 10-year journey to ban vinyl chloride. So we're looking forward to working with moms and many other groups on banning vinyl chloride. We need the Biden administration to advocate for a very strong international treaty on plastics, which is currently being negotiated by the UN. And unfortunately, it's not going well. The United States is not providing leadership on the treaty. After this meeting, I'm going over to the State Department for a meeting to try to make the case that the US should be a leader in advocating for a binding international treaty that puts a cap on the production of plastics and recognizes the health implications. We've heard that chemical lobbyists are trying to get the Biden administration to support something called chemical recycling in the treaty, which would be a terrible mistake. Chemical recycling is basically using high heat or toxic chemicals to deal with plastic waste. It's a terrible idea. No one should be advancing that as a solution. So we need some clarity from the Biden administration on that. And also, we need the Biden administration to recognize that plastics recycling has been an abysmal failure. I'm a big supporter of recycling. I started my town's recycling program when I was home on maternity leave many years ago, changing cloth diapers on my above average baby. So I love recycling, but plastics by definition are not recyclable. Too many different toxic chemicals in plastics, too many different colors, too many different resins, and the plastics recycling rate is an abysmal 5 to 6%, but yet the EPA plastic policy is still lifting up plastics recycling as a solution, when what we really need to do is reduce the use of plastic, phase it out, and invest in reduction, reuse, and refill. It wasn't long ago that many beverages came in refillable glass bottles. Refill and reuse is the future, and it also creates more jobs. That's my short list. When the president first took office, a number of environmental groups led by Center for Biological Diversity created a document. Maybe it was called Plastic Free President, but a lot of those recommendations have not been embraced, but there's still time.
Thank you so much, Judith. And to drive the point home, I want to do a quick lightning round, maybe 3 sentences max per person. What do you want? There are many parents in the room, so what do you want them to know right now? I mean, we've already been talking about it, just to drive the point home so that when they leave, they can understand exactly one thing I took away from this. What do you want them to know about how we can address, in your experience, the climate disruption and air pollution for our young people and their mental and physical health? Oh, Lisa, sorry. Yes, start with you.
The lightning round. I think the one thing I want them to know is that their voice matters. And in 2024, your voice matters by voting. So it is the most important thing you can do. Climate change, fossil fuel companies have been very successful in making us think that it is our individual fault and that putting that plastic bottle into the recycling is my climate act, and it is not, for all the reasons that have been mentioned. But it is a policy issue, a structural issue. And so the best way for you to affect systems and structures and policies is to please vote. and talk to your decision makers, tell them that climate change is a health issue. Back to the point Paul made, this is not an issue of politics. This is an issue of our children's health.
I'm very much along the same lines. Your voice does matter. Movements that have made a difference, starting with the US, have had a grassroots swell to them. A lot can really happen when mothers, parents, caregivers, teachers, you name it, come together with one voice and a demand. So that's the first thing, because at times it does feel like, where is our effort going? It's kind of unclear at times. We have a voter guide at the Children's Environmental Health Network, so if that can be helpful for local elections, for presidential elections, we cover 6 main themes within the field of children's environmental health, and it's a way to engage as the voting public, but also to engage with your elected leaders, and for campaigns to make a stand on their websites or with their voting public. What would they do if elected to protect children from environmental hazards and a changing climate?
Alice Walker said, "Activism is the rent we pay for living on this planet." We have the facts. We have scientific data. We need more women in particular in the arena as activists, holding elected officials and corporations accountable for change. We're running out of time. And the longer we wait on the climate crisis and the plastic pollution problems, it's going to be harder to fix the problems. Tick-tock, people. When the people lead, the leaders will follow. All of our organizations have lots of information, but get in the arena, show up at city council meetings, county legislature meetings, climb the ladder. Join us in Albany. We're trying to pass a really comprehensive packaging reduction law, the strongest in the country. Congress is rough. At Beyond Plastics in Congress, we mostly play whack-a-mole, trying to beat back bad ideas. But there's a lot of exciting development at the state and local level that people can access. So all of our organizations have information, and activism is fun. And bring your kids to the meetings. They're paying attention.
Thank you so much. This last round is actually a wonderful segue into the panel that's coming after this. But as we start to think about solutions, I'm really grateful that you three were able to give us just a wonderful understanding of the simple actions we can start to take today or tomorrow in our local communities. So thank you again to our distinguished panelists, and I hope you guys took a lot from this, because I certainly did. So thank you guys so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Osasenaga, and all of our wonderful panelists. I hope you all got some great information there. And as I said earlier at the top, leave a little bit more inspired and full of hope. We need to be listening to young people and responding to their desire to make the world a healthier, more sustainable place, and to try to empower them to do just that. I didn't write this call to action. Chelsea Clinton did. But it captures what I and so many of us feel in our hearts, and why we center our work on children at Mom's Clean Air Force. It is an honor to have Chelsea, a dedicated public health advocate, a celebrated climate champion, an author, a mother, here today with us to share insights about children and climate, thanks to her dedication and work as vice chair of the Clinton Foundation, as well as her dedication to their wide-reaching and highly impactful early childhood initiative, Too Small to Fail, which is now in its 10th year, which I think deserves a round of applause. It is a milestone. She's in conversation today with my friend, journalist and editor-in-chief of Parents, Grace Bastidas, who gives voice to caregivers and to marginalized communities, and whose work reaches 9 million readers a month. Readers, she tells me, who are increasingly concerned about the impacts of air pollution and climate change on children's health. Thank you for joining us, Chelsea and Grace.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much. Gracias for making me part of this very important conversation. I have the pleasure of talking to Chelsea Clinton, Vice Chair of the Clinton Foundation, as you've heard, about that connection between brain development and climate change and what Too Small to Fail is doing to bring solutions to kids and families. Welcome, Chelsea. Bienvenida.
Thank you so much, Grace. It's really wonderful to be with all of you here this morning. I want to say thank you to you and to Parents Magazine for highlighting this critically important issue and also helping to inform and empower parents with what we can do to best protect our kids in a changing climate and a warming world. I want to thank everyone at the National Press Club for keeping us well hydrated and well caffeinated. As a mom of 3, I particularly appreciate the latter. And I really want to just thank Moms Clean Air Force for all of the tremendous work that all of you do every day in our communities around the country with your 1.5 million members, moms, and I know some dads too. It's just really fantastic to be in a community of doers. So just really wanted to start with a lot of gratitude, and I look forward to our conversation, Grace.
Yes, and speaking of doers, Too Small to Fail was created 10 years ago with a focus on very young children, ages 0 to 5, and brain development. And congrats on a decade of impact. Tell us about that work and how you are now moving towards making climate advocacy part of the strategy at Too Small to Fail.
Thank you so much, Grace. And really, I also want to take the chance to acknowledge Patty Miller, who's the CEO of Too Small to Fail.
Love Patty.
We love Patty. Oh, there she is. She's waving. Yes. And her kind of mighty, indefatigable team who just is constantly kind of thinking and kind of creating kind of different ways in which we can best meet parents and other adults who are in children's lives with the tools and the resources that we need and that we would hope anyone kind of would need and should have access to be effective teachers for our kind of youngest family members. And so Too Small to Fail was kind of started with a simple premise that kind of everyone wants what's best for our kids, and that we should kind of meet parents wherever they may be with what is best for their kids. And so kind of what started off initially as more of a kind of broad-based kind of public awareness effort working with local municipalities to put messaging on kind of bus stops and in subways now has kind of blossomed into multiple different types of partnerships in the spaces and places where we work with families. And so yes, we still do have transportation campaigns. One of the more fun things I did last year was actually get to be in Philadelphia and ride around the city buses that have our messaging of kind of read, sing, and talk to kids, and that transportation time is still teaching time. I also did get a little bit car sick because I was like trying to read all the messages as we were like going kind of on the commuting routes. But we're also now in hundreds of laundromats through our partnership with the Coin Laundromat Association. Low-income families in America spend on average 2 to 4 hours a week in Coin laundromats, and so we now have helped build hundreds of libraries and kind of fun, nurturing play spaces in laundromats. That's also something that the laundromat owners like, because we now have a lot of evidence that says not only do those spaces engender more kind of reading, teaching, and talking time between caregivers and children, and that's good for kids' early brain development. We also have a lot of evidence that it's good for how parents or even grandparents feel about themselves and kind of their stewardship and their teaching and their nurturing of their children and grandchildren. We've also found, though, that it's good for the laundromat owners, that families are willing to walk or drive further to use laundromat facilities where there are kind of libraries and kind of happy, nurturing play spaces kind of as part of that environment. We've had similar partnerships with WIC clinics around the country. We have a growing partnership with kind of social services offices in California, hoping that our 6 counties will soon build to every county in California. And perhaps most salient to this conversation, we now have more than 1,300 playgrounds that we've rolled out around the country that have kind of prompts to encourage kind of playtime to also be teaching time. You know, how many shapes do you see? How many colors do you see? How many times can you swing on the swing? Kind of early math, early literacy, building blocks, but also with shade. Because we know that in our warming climate, the dangers are particularly acute for our youngest. We know that extreme heat is so dangerous for infants and toddlers. And we also know that for many families, it is still important to be outside because it may be actually more well ventilated and relatively cooler than in their indoor spaces. And so how can we make kind of the outdoors kind of not only more kind of hospitable and more nurturing of brain development, but also safer for kids and their families? So really grateful to be here with Moms Clean Air Force, because I know that is also work that kind of they've been focused on since their inception, and to continue to kind of listen and learn from the great, important, vital work that we know is happening everywhere across our country, to then think about how can we use our platform and our partnerships to kind of get what's working in some places to help it work in more places for more kids and families everywhere.
So you're reaching families in a way that's super accessible, that it doesn't become just one more thing they have to do, because families are overwhelmed, overburdened. So you're putting the resources right in front of them, so it becomes part of their lives. What has been the feedback from caregivers?
Kind of exactly that, actually, Grace. Like, thank you for helping us make what we were already doing kind of productive teaching time for our kids. You know, you're changing a diaper, you can talk to your kids. You're making dinner, you can talk to your kids. You're in a grocery store, you can talk to your kids. You're at a bus stop, you can talk to your kids. And hopefully, kind of with our prompts, it is, yes, kind of the language itself, which is so important, but also helping to build kind of the curiosity and the kind of critical thinking architecture that we also know is so important. You know, the vast majority of our brains are built by the time we're 3, which is kind of an extraordinary thing to think about now as the parent of a 4-year-old. And I'm like, oh gosh, I hope I've done enough. Because he's already like well past the 80% mark of kind of brain development. But also what's really important to us in the now, I think 16 kind of academic evaluations we've done of different aspects of our work, looking at kind of, you know, the pre and post effects in laundromats, you know, playgrounds, kind of transportation, our partnerships with grocery stores. We're working with family courts in Wisconsin, a moment of acute stress and anxiety for family, to help kind of family court waiting rooms be kind of more warm and welcoming spaces for kids and family. Is what has surprised me most is not actually how many more words kids are hearing, how their language development has really had kind of parabolic effect when there are easily accessible resources built into the places and spaces where parents and caregivers are already spending time. But what has surprised me is how strong an effect we've seen on parents and caregivers, which I know I spoke about earlier, but I do think kind of really bears repeating, with apologies if I'm belaboring it, that it makes parents and other caregivers feel better about themselves, more connected to their children, that they have stronger bonds to their children, that they feel like those bonds are a stronger foundation for kind of lifelong kind of relationships. And we know that that then is good not only in the here and now, but has truly kind of long-term dramatic positive effects for kids and parents, and then also ultimately communities.
And I love the community angle, because it makes it feel like we as families are part of this collective rather than fending for ourselves, which is what we often feel like as we try to tackle all these societal problems that we face. So, and then you're also bringing these two conversations together, brain development and climate advocacy, and connecting those dots, which is so key, because so much of a child's brain, like you said, is developing before a certain age. And climate change and climate disruption affects so many other systems. And we know there's a huge disparity, we've talked about it this morning, when it comes to the air we breathe, especially for people of color and marginalized communities. How are you reaching those folks in a way that feels authentic?
Well, Grace, I think thank you for kind of highlighting kind of children in kind of the broader climate conversation and how you asked the question. It was also, I think, incredibly important that Administrator Regan made it so clear in the announcement yesterday of the new air quality standards, that a kind of major catalyst for the administration taking action was all of the now kind of indisputable science around how devastating kind of soot and kind of higher particulate matter concentration in the air is for pregnant people, for infants, and for small children. And so I think we have to work kind of, in two parallel tracks. Of course, trying to decarbonize our world, kind of help us have kind of less pollutants be pumped into the world, kind of tackle everything that we know is kind of driving and accelerating the climate crisis. And we also have to simultaneously do all that we can to protect kids and families today. And we have to be able to hopefully do that kind of in a coherent way with sufficient kind of urgency and intentionality on both. We cannot do either of those things, though, if we're not listening to the communities most affected. We have to be kind of listening to, learning from, in partnership with, and following kind of the communities who are most affected, both kind of by the ongoing toxicity that is being kind of pumped out into the air, people who live close to kind of the largest polluters who are most being harmed by our failure to address climate change at a large kind of systemic level, and also children who live everywhere that are being harmed by kind of rising temperatures and rising concentrations of particulate matter. And we think about what happened in Phoenix last year, right? Where there was more than a month of 110-degree temperature, and how terrifying that is for parents. And so to think, what can we do to listen to parents kind of who are most affected at every part of the kind of climate change challenge, and how to meet them with the resources that they need to help best protect kids. We think what we can do is help build more playgrounds that have more shade. We think what we can do is to be in partnership with local communities that are pushing for better ventilation in schools. We think what we can do is helping communities who are pushing for more year-round school access, so there's always a cool place for their kids to safely play, learn, and study, even when it's not during the school year. We think what we can do is to help make our laundromats more climate conscious, climate smart, and kind of more well ventilated. We think what we can do is to have those same conversations with the WIC clinics and the social services office and everywhere where we're already kind of working in partnership with people who have centered kids and families. And of course, I think, Grace, what is hugely important to us is to always be doing this work in kind of the language and ways in which kind of parents already communicate with the world around them and with their kids. And so one of the things that I am kind of particularly proud that we were able to do is during the depths of the COVID-19 pandemic was to work with a variety of partners to help get kind of books in native languages about what was happening with COVID, why social distancing was important, and then why masking was important, and then why vaccination was important, kind of into indigenous communities. And so the largest program was with the Navajo Nation, but it wasn't the only program. Because I think so often we don't include our indigenous communities, our Native Americans, our First Nation communities in these conversations. And so also helping to kind of bring kind of more people from more places and spaces who are the most affected is something else that we think is hugely important, and we're going to keep trying to use our platform to do just that.
So storytelling is a big component of the messaging at Too Small to Fail, and I know that you and Secretary Clinton have gone to Hollywood and met with content producers about getting the word out. Can you talk a little bit about that? My good friend Patty Miller, I like to call her my good friend, she mentioned that you are also in creating a playbook for Hollywood on climate advocacy. So can you talk about how that will play out?
Yes, so my mom and I did go to Hollywood a number of years ago now to talk to a wide range of content creators about kind of our hope that they would embed in their stories, in their narratives, kind of role modeling, reading, teaching, kind of singing and talking to kids. And thankfully, quite a few did just that. And so everything from kind of Orange is the New Black to various Law and Order franchises kind of embedded in their stories, kind of people reading to kind of their children, whether their children were coming to visit them in incarcerated settings like Orange is the New Black, or a victim being interviewed by the Law and Order detectives who would say, you know, like, I just need a minute, like I need to like finish reading this book, or, oh yes, I'm being interviewed because I applied to be a foster parent and I am really gonna highlight how important it is to read, sing, and talk to my kid. I know that, I hope that's gonna help my application process. And so hopefully not in a way that felt kind of glommed on or awkward, but really kind of authentic and embedded in the stories that these content creators were already telling about kind of their principal characters. We saw kind of a real measurable effect from that. We were kind of inspired by the kind of historic efforts to work in partnership with Hollywood from kind of public health advocates. So we had seen how important storytelling had been to raise awareness about the dangers of drunk driving, as one example, and kind of consistent messaging kind of through kind of partnership with some major content creators helped radically change public opinion in this country around the acceptability of drunk driving. Also had a pretty measurable effect on kind of ameliorating stigma around HIV and AIDS status. And so we had known that kind of this could work for kind of very kind of specific kind of health risks or stigmas. We had not known, would it have a measurable risk about trying to change kind of ongoing behavior? Because while of course it's great if you read like one more book to your kid one day, what really matters is that consistent 15 minutes of reading, singing, or talking to your child every day. And thankfully we found that there was a measurable effect. And so we hope that Hollywood will again be interested in helping us inform parents that climate change, extreme heat, particulate matter are real risks to kids, but hopefully to not leave them just with what could be an overwhelming and dispiriting and discouraging message, but then to follow that with, and here's what you can do to still help kind of protect your child's kind of health and healthy development and well-being.
It's similar to putting medicine in applesauce, right? You serve it
I've
in
never done that. No, of course not.
There's so much anxiety around climate change, and as parents, it always feels like the onus is on us to solve all the world's problems. And while we should continue fighting for a sustainable future, how are you targeting policy makers to create systemic change?
Well, I think, you know, I wish what I were about to say would not be political, but it invariably is. You know, I wish that we always had elected officials and appointed officials who believed in kind of listening to scientists, understanding science, not reacted passively, kind of taking action to better protect kind of communities, and particularly our most vulnerable children, yes, but also our elderly, kind of people with kind of certain underlying conditions. And I'm so grateful that we have that leadership now in President Biden and in Administrator Regan. I have deep kind of palpitating worry about kind of the juxtaposition to that, of when we live in a time, as we did not that long ago, where we had people in similar positions who were not only disinterested and apathetic toward the science, but actively kind of dismissing and discrediting of it. And so certainly I think as a parent, I'm proud of many parts of kind of who I am. Like, I'm very proud to be my parents' daughter. I'm very proud of kind of the work that I get to do every day. I'm proud of the work that I have done, you know, particularly as a teacher at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia. But my most important identity is as a parent. And so when I go and vote as a citizen, yes, but also principally as a parent. And so I hope that as parents, kind of we think about the fact that we're parents every day, including on an election day. And I hope we also understand why what is happening at our local school district level matters to whether or not we're best protecting our kids from climate change. What happens at our kind of county commissioner level, our city council level, that matters too, because the type of pavement or concrete that's going to get laid when the streets are repaved matters. Is it going to be porous concrete that's going to help better absorb kind of heat and water or not? It matters to the paint we're using on our municipal buildings. It matters to whether we have local recycling programs. It matters to what's happening kind of at the state level with kind of state kind of building standards and whether there are additional air quality standards. And of course, it matters at a federal level. So that's part of how I think about this, but I also think about like how do we, again, help parents understand kind of what they can do now to help protect their kids today so that they don't get so overwhelmed that they feel like everything's hopeless, because it's not. We know there are better ways to protect kids versus not. We know the things that we can do. And so it's so important to us at Too Small to Fail to help inform parents, but then hopefully help empower them so that we each can feel like even in a warming climate where there is lots to worry about and hopefully be activated toward, there's still ways that we can help take care of our precious kids.
Well, with that, we end our panel, and thank you so much, Chelsea.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you to parents.
From one mama bear to another, thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Please welcome the Chair of the President's Council on Environmental Quality, Brenda Mallory.
Good morning, everyone. It's such an honor to be here and to stand in front of such a great group of effective advocates who are doing some wonderful work in helping to protect our environment. As you heard, my name is Brenda Mallory. I'm the chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality. And one of the great privileges that I have in that job is to just be able to connect with people all across the country who are on the ground doing the great work, and that is such a privilege. I want to start just by thanking the organizers for this particular event for the work that went into making it happen. I want to in particular add my staff to that and all the staff that was involved, because these things don't just happen, and I think we all need to acknowledge that as we go from event to event, recognizing all the work that has gone into these things. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the President's agenda on environment and climate change, and so that's what I'm going to do today. I want to just start by saying what an honor it is to speak after Chelsea Clinton, who has been such a long time advocate for public health and children and families, and I just want to applaud her in the other room for all that she's doing and for the work that she continues to do in this area. This morning's panel took a deep dive into climate challenges we face and their impacts on health and well-being to young people and to families. And that includes air pollution and plastic pollution and climate disruption, all impacting us in very different ways and pretty continuously. And so now we head into the next panel, which is focused on solutions to those challenges. And I want to thank the moms for the invitation to share a little bit about what our work has included and how the administration is advancing solutions to the climate crisis that are making a difference on the ground. So like many of you in the room and many of you who are streaming, I too am a parent. My children are young adults now who are beginning to think about their own families. And parenting is an experience that I think makes all of us see the world a little differently, see it through the lens of our children and their futures. And it's why I think so many of us have been fighting for so long to try to protect the environment, to try to clean up the environment, because we know that if there is to be a future, that we have to work together in order to make changes in the conditions that we are all facing. a cleaner and a healthier environment will not just happen, just like these events don't just happen. So as the chair of the council, I help lead the president's work on climate change, on clean energy, on conservation, on environmental justice. And really, since day one, the president has really advanced the most ambitious environmental justice, climate change agenda that we've ever seen. The day-to-day work in trying to take his ambition and the principles that I think he has us all driving under is a real effort. And it's an effort that would not be successful but for the partnerships that we're able to create with folks like you. The agenda is guided by a very simple belief, and that is a belief that everyone deserves clean air, clean water, and a healthy community. And everything else kind of flows from that basic premise. It's one that I know that this organization has been very focused on in the work that you're doing and what drives a lot of the agenda that you have set forth. Related to that basic premise, I think we all last year witnessed the current United States Supreme Court issue one of the largest judicial rollbacks of environmental protection in history that undermined vital clean water safeguards. It was just a reminder that the environmental protections that we have held sacred and believe are necessary are under attack. We need your experience not only for the clean air and climate change efforts that you all are focused on, but also in recognizing that the links between kind of the core health and environmental values and the fundamental necessity of clean water is very clear. Those are things that have to go together. And so as our administration is moving forward and trying to take steps on the clean air agenda, we are also very mindful of how all of these things are interconnected. One of the things that the administration has recognized, and the president speaks about this often, is that too many people for too long have really not received those basic benefits that we think our environmental protection system should offer. And we know that this is work that is going to be a long-term, has to have a long-term commitment from the government, long-term commitment for those who care, and we're kind of see ourselves as kind of charting a path forward and putting in place critical elements that will help advance its success. A critical part of the president's work is the Justice 40 initiative, which sets a goal of 40% of the overall benefits of federal climate, clean energy, affordable, sustainable housing, clean water, going to disadvantaged communities that have been denied those basic protections. And this is really transformational work and is enabling us to structure 518 programs across 19 federal agencies with this as a priority in the funding and work that we're doing that is leading to benefits like cleaner air, good paying jobs, and affordable clean energy. Many of these programs are made possible by the historic investments included in the President's Investing in America agenda. And they are having real impacts on the ground. I'm just going to name a couple quickly. You know, for example, in West Virginia and in other areas that have been dealing with pollution from contaminated properties, the bipartisan infrastructure law is helping to clean up orphaned oil wells and abandoned mines. In Charlotte, North Carolina, I had the privilege to go when we were announcing funding from the Inflation Reduction Act for the planting and maintaining of trees in communities, which we understand to be really important in lowering temperatures and improving air quality. Over 417 communities across the country have received benefits from this Department of Agriculture program. Last month, we announced $1 billion in awards from the Investing in America agenda for clean school buses. So all of these things are happening now. There's a lot more that is in the works. But I just want to give moms a hand for the ways in which your work and advocacy has really supported some of this work occurring, and which I think that partnership that we have is going to be really important as we move forward. I think the thing that I would like to leave you all with is just a recognition that we are trying to infuse notions and principles of equity and justice in all of the work that we're doing. And as we move forward in each step, that is very much a consideration that's on the table. And you'll hear later today from Administrator Regan, who will be talking about some of the specific things that he is doing over at the Environmental Protection Agency, where he is awesome and grateful to have him as a partner. But I think he also, will underscore the importance of the partnership that we have with you. And so I'm going to stop there because I know you have a full agenda. So thank you very much for allowing me to be here today.
Please welcome to stage our next group of panelists and your panel moderator, Patrice Tomcik.
All right, thank you, Chair Mallory. And I want to ask our panelists to go ahead and make their way up if they can. My name is Patrice Tomcik, and I am the National Field Director for Moms Clean Air Force. And we'll begin our second panel discussion, and it is titled Climate Disruption, Air Pollution, and Young People, Opportunities for Building a Better Future. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Susan Anenberg, who's the professor and chair of Environmental and Occupational Health Department at the George Washington University Milken Institute School of Public Health. And she is the director of the George Washington Climate and Health Institute. Thank you, Dr. Annenberg, for being here today. Next, we have Aishah-Nyeta Brown, and she is a climate advocate, a researcher, storyteller, and social media manager for Good Energy Stories and the Climate Health Network. Welcome, Aishah-Nyeta. Next, we have Dr. Lise Van Susteren, who's a general and forensic psychiatrist in Washington, D.C., an expert on the physical and mental health effects of climate disruption. And you can refer to your program for their complete bios. So there's no real simple single solution to the climate crisis, and climate disruption and air pollution will be the defining backdrop for the rest of our lives and for the lives of our children. But there is tremendous hope as we're seeing unprecedented progress and momentum in climate action. So in this session, our panelists will speak to a range of creative climate solutions, and these are already making the world a healthier, safer place for young people. So before we dive into the expertise of our panels, I want to share a little bit more about Moms Clean Air Force and how we view solutions to air pollution and climate change. We believe that we must push for broad systemic change, and we help parents and caregivers to elevate their voices with administrators, lawmakers, and agencies. We work on changing climate laws and strengthening clean air protections. So now I'd like to share with you a little bit more about my story. And so my story is centered around the EPA oil and gas methane standards that were recently passed in December of 2023. This is really personal for me and how I got started with Moms Clean Air Force. I live with oil and gas operations in my community located in southwestern Pennsylvania. And in fact, active fracking had just finished up as I was leaving to come here. And what this involves is an industrial process that drills really deep within the earth to extract oils and gases and fossil fuels. And also what comes up are things like methane, ethane that is used for plastics, and also other very harmful pollutants. So there are lots of active fracked wells in my community, and the closest that is about half a mile away from my children's school, where 3,200 children attend school there every single day. I know that oil and gas operations, they emit climate warming methane and other really harmful pollutants that can really be harmful to children's health and can cause things like respiratory illnesses and even cancer. And so this is really concerning for children, as you heard from the panel before about their health and how vulnerable children are. My son is a pediatric cancer survivor. So I fear for his health every single day that he goes to school. I'm really concerned about what he breathes into his lungs, because I know that he has a greater risk of having cancer again. So for nearly a decade, I led the fight with Mom's Clean Air Force for strong EPA methane protections, because quickly and significantly lowering the methane pollution and the other harmful pollutants is one of the fastest ways that we have to really reduce one of the fastest ways, best levers we have to slow the rate of climate change and to help clean up the air and protect children's health. So these EPA methane rules are a perfect example of why I believe in these systemic changes, and they really make a difference. This, in conjunction with the federal investments in plugging orphan and gas wells, will really go a long way towards slowing climate disruption and protecting children's health. Every child has the right to breathe clean air and the right to a stable climate. So now I'd like to turn to our panelists. So to kick off our panel discussion, I'm honored to turn to Dr. Susan Anenberg. And Dr. Anenberg, you are a deeply respected public health researcher, and your research has shed light on the impact of air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions on our health, as well as on health disparities. Can you talk to us about why strong policies are key to protecting the health of children and young people, and why they are key to environmental justice?
Absolutely. Well, let me just actually start by thanking Mom's Clean Air Force for having me here. It is really fantastic to be able to marry my two identities as a mom to my 3 boys and a public health researcher in climate change and air pollution. So I'm delighted to be able to bring my personal motivation here as well as my scientific expertise. You know, one of the things kids say the darndest things. One of the things my 8-year-old said to me about a year ago was, air is the most popular thing in the world. And, you know, it just came out of the blue. I don't think he knows what I do for a living. But it is true that we all have to breathe the air, and we do not personally have control over what is in the air that we're breathing. It may look like we're breathing the same air here in this room as outdoors sometimes, but it's not the case. There are little tiny microscopic solid and liquid particles in the air. There's a range of chemicals in the air, and the content of that air differs wherever you are. So here, sitting in this room, our air might be relatively clean. Maybe this building has an air filtration system. As soon as I walk outdoors and walk up Pennsylvania Avenue to George Washington University, I'm breathing in a range of, mostly car exhaust from gasoline-powered cars, some diesel-powered trucks, and that's going to contain nitrogen dioxide. That's going to contain organic carbon and black carbon. If you're living near a coal-fired power plant, maybe you're breathing in a lot of sulfate. So the air that we're breathing differs depending on what is in the environment and how we move about our lives. We don't often have control over that. So if I drive an electric vehicle, or if I choose to take public transportation or bike to work, that doesn't necessarily mean that the air that I'm breathing is going to be clean. And this is the reason that we need governmental action. We are contributing collectively to the pollution that we're breathing. What we do as an individual matters, but what we do collectively has the power to impact air quality for kids here and around the world. So, I'm really energized to see some very strong governmental action happening, and I think that's a point of hope for all of us, is that, we have agency here. We can change the course of the climate trajectory, and that has benefits in terms of improved air quality now and improved health now.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Anenberg. You said something that was really important, and that is that individually our voices are really important. Collectively, they are basically powerful, right? And we need to engage with our government to make these protections happen. So thank you for that. Now I'd like to turn to Aishah-Nyeta. And you describe yourself as a climate advocate, researcher, and storyteller. And you've spoken about the role of art and storytelling in helping us cope with mental health aspects of climate change, anchored in environmental justice movement. We know that real-life stories are very effective at driving climate action, and this is a lot of what Moms Clean Air Force does too. So, as it relates to solutions, what makes art and storytelling such an important and action-oriented part of the movement for climate justice?
Yes, thank you so much for that question, and also just want to spread some gratitude for moms for having me here today. So in terms of solutions, how I look at it from this creative point of view is that, like climate change, stories are so intertwined with all of us. All of us have an individual story, like you shared your story just briefly at starting this panel off. Every single one of us has a story. Every single one of us is touched by a story. Every single one of us is touched by climate change. And it's as unique as a fingerprint, for example. And I think that that is what makes it so important, is that these two things that touch everything can be created into art. I think everything is sort of art. I think this is art. I think the climate movement is art in its own way. It's involved. It's kind of like what your little boy said about air being the most popular thing. How I interpreted that is how I interpret stories and climate change. It touches everything. Air touches everything. It's a part of everything. And so to draw people into, you know, their individual actions, but also systems changes, you think about what calls people, what is their sensory sort of vibe in the world, and in stories, entertainment, and a lot of times stories have some part of the story that is sad or heavy, and then we turn it around for the better, or there's something, some sort of solution at the end of the story. I think it's very similar with climate change. There's a story that we're telling here. There's a community that we're fostering together, and as we keep moving, the solutions kind of, they sort of raise their own hands. They're like, oh, me, here's a story. And so, like, you know, with my job, I also work really closely with Hollywood, and, you know, there are stories that are written, and what we do at Good Energy is sort of help those stories sort of intertwine that climate story in a way that is relatable to everyone.
Thank you. Stories really move people and move action. And another question for you is, how can art and storytelling help young people feel more empowered and connected when it comes to facing the climate crisis?
So, empowering young people through story, yes. I think that from my point of view, that something that, well, especially with the digital age and technology and all of this stuff, there's always something to follow along with, a story that is inspiring, and I think kids especially have this really large imagination where sort of they believe that anything is possible, right? So I think using that imagination and that sort of aiding these stories can help with that.
Yeah, very good. We can learn a lot from children, how they view the world as air is everywhere, and their stories, and we can really learn a lot from that, so thank you. Now I'd like to turn to Dr. Lisa. And Dr. Lisa, you are a psychiatrist with decades of experience and one of the foremost experts on the impact of climate change and youth mental health. Last June, you testified on the witness stand at the Held versus Montana trial, in which 16 Montana youth brought a constitutional climate lawsuit against their state to protect their equal rights to a healthy environment, and they won. How are you seeing climate disruption and air pollution impact young people's mental, emotional, and spiritual health?
Well, thank you for that question, and I'm delighted to be here. It's very different to be here versus being in a courtroom where the bad guys are all around you. The good guys are there too. But I will say that that was a fun victory. And having the court bang the gavel on what was an outrageous situation is a really inspiring moment, and it was fun to be a part of it. So one thing I'd like to note for everyone is that our physical health and our mental health is a two-way street. So what happens to us physically affects our mental health, and what happens to us mentally affects our physical health. The Romans, Greeks, it's an ancient, mens sano in corpore sano. And I like to say it because I had to have 4 years of Latin, so I trotted out. It means a healthy mind in a healthy body. So the key issue here is that when, and there are a whole wealth of obvious impacts on kids. And I know that parents hear a lot and about their kids' mental health, and we can get back to that in a second about how to look at that. But it's true. The kids don't live in a cave. They know that there are problems. And sure, they can be resilient, but resilience has its limits. And so when you are exposed to extreme weather events, and you have understandable fear, anger, sorrow, the impacts of those sentiments can rise to the level sometimes of psychological conditions, particularly if those incidents are repeated. And if they are, they fall into the category of what we describe as, and people can look this up, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And what we see is that when kids do have a history of ACEs, over the lifespan, they are more likely to have illness, and they're more likely to die young. And one of the reasons is that when you are stricken with these emotions, what can happen is that you become depressed, you become deeply, potentially anxious, traumatized with post-traumatic stress disorder. Your parents around you, domestic violence is possible, drug and alcohol issues, and all of these affect your behaviors and your decision-making. And ultimately, that obviously causes behavioral problems all across the life spectrum. And let me just add on that on a much deeper level, there's also the realization kids have that in a sense, this is an intergenerational issue. And I'm not talking to the people here, but I am talking to others. The reality is there is some intergenerational aggression in play here, which causes the children ultimately to feel a sense of abandonment and even betrayal by their government. And I'll speak in greater detail if you want me to, but if I'm left to do a stream of consciousness, it will be a bad thing. So I will stop here, and if you have follow-up questions, I'd be delighted to answer them.
Thank you, Dr. Lisa. ACEs, that's something new for me, and so thank you for sharing that. How can we translate what we know into solutions that you think will make a real difference for young people?
So this is under the heading of turning what we know into what we do. And I am going to exhort, not the people here, but many of my colleagues. And one of the hazards of being in the kind of work that I do is that we get very intellectualized about things. And as a friend of mine once said about more research papers, and sure, we need research, it's good, but it has to be practical. It has to be something that we can use. And as he said, more research in some instances is like rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic to get a better view. What we need now is for the mental health profession, for, of course, all health professions, to take this issue and realize that it has the seriousness that it has. We need a subspecialty in climate and mental health, and we need mental health professionals. It's been referred to several times today already. Meet those policymakers where they are. Bring children with you so they can talk about their personal experiences. It's hard to resist the emotion of a child talking about the personal fears, the grief, etc. And have the mental health professionals present saying this is what we need to do. And I'll identify just very, very quickly three key elements. The first thing is, on a state level, community level, et cetera, we need to evaluate the vulnerabilities and the strengths of every region. Community, state, whatever it is. That means our personal resilience, our physical resilience, who's vulnerable, who isn't, what are our strengths. And then we need step two. We need a public-private partnership where everybody works together to figure out how to enhance the resilience building that is inherent in understanding these vulnerabilities and strengths. And we must call upon our elected officials. We need a cabinet-level climate solutions office, not just nationally, which of course we need that as well, every bit as important as the Department of Defense, but we also need it in our states and in our communities. We need oversight of all of these various elements that have to work together in order to protect and preserve the children that we are speaking of today and who are among the most vulnerable.
Thank you, Dr. Lisa, for outlining those three solutions. And along the lines, you talked about a cabinet position. And what are some of the policy changes you think we need to support young people's mental health?
The policy changes are, well, we have done some good work, and by we I mean a sort of ad hoc committee. And I want to say, too, people need to start sometimes wherever they're feeling the connection. It doesn't have to be big. You can start small and build with other people. And this is what we did at the Climate Psychiatry Alliance and the Climate Psychology Alliance. We now have an outreach and advocacy committee that is an ad hoc sort of committee. Anybody's welcome. And we have reached out to individual states. What we did here, and I'll just talk about the District of Columbia, which really is, of course, our capital city and a model, and it has been particularly responsive. We met with the DC Climate Change Commission, and we talked about the various inroads that can be made. So what did we bring up with them? The mental health aspects of various issues. For example, K through 12 education, showing kids that we are ready to teach them about the things that we know are going to be important to them, that they will need over their life course and that they will use in the future. We have talked to them about training healthcare workers, about training social service workers, about creating resilience hubs, about the kinds of protections that they can have that are physical and mental in establishing those resilience hubs. We have talked about the effects of migration and what we have to do to be prepared for that. And we've also talked about disaster preparedness and disaster prevention. So a whole range, and I'm going to call out my friend Howard Kurtzman, who did a brilliant job. And if you get back in touch with me or Mom's Clean Air Force, you can use the work that we've done as a model and change it for your state, your region. It's there. Don't reinvent it. Use it, personalize it. Those are just some of the inroads that can create policy. And I'll just say this. Every time we talk to people, they say, oh yeah, you know, I hadn't thought about the emotional toll. Once you hear it, you realize, my gosh, that touches everything. So bring it up repeatedly. It's persistence that is the order of the day.
All right, thank you. And then one more question is, one of the projects that you've been working on recently is called the Eco-Psychopedia. And
Eco-Psy for short, because everybody's saying eco-psycho, which might be more fitting, but it's eco-psyche. So we realized we were way over our heads with that. Eco-Psy.
Okay, Eco-Psy, I'll go with that. Can you tell us a little bit more about that project and how parents can use it?
Well, again, this is something that we hope will be useful for policymakers, certainly for parents, for journalists, for the interested lay public. It started off as something very different. It evolved to this. It is like your wiki of all things climate and mental health. And you can go there. It's a prescribed structure, so you'll recognize it. And it's easy to understand language. You can get in there, understand what you need to know, and get out. But it's all things related to climate and mental health. It's our effort. We recognize we're talking to the converted sometimes here, but what we need to do is have a language, because people don't always understand science. And so this is everyday language so people can understand the issues. Got 24 entries right now written by experts or vetted by experts, but in everyday language. You can go there, you can understand. We're going to have a glossary. People can go there and expect that the information that they get is reliable. No, I won't say the word that's coming to mind. It's reliable information.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Lisa. We'll have to take a look at that. Now I'd like to go to Aishah-Nyeta. And I understand you're working on a children's show related to climate and reaching the masses through TV and platforms that people are already using and tuned into really sounds like a solution to me. So how did this show come about, and what are its goals in the short term and long term?
Right, yes. So I am working on a children's show that talks about climate change. And what inspired the show is, like you were mentioning, I had adverse childhood experiences. I've always felt the need to help people, and I love children, and I feel like, again, with their imaginations, anything is possible. And so the show is sort of based on my own childhood imagination with my 2 stuffed animals, and we build this world together where we go on adventures and solve solutions. It's me, like, at a younger age, obviously. And we go around actual real-world places and talk about climate, and we talk about a lot about emotional leveling and like what people are experiencing, these very unique climate impacts and effects in these unique ways, and how they're feeling about it, and what we can do about it, and how we can empathize with that feeling of overwhelm that comes with the climate crisis, with people all around the world. The goal is to reach children globally. Maybe it'll start locally first. I'm from Virginia, so maybe it'll be like, you know, different schools around Virginia and maybe DC at some point. And I want kids to know that their imagination is important, their voices are needed, and if you can imagine, whatever you can imagine for yourself, it's possible. And remember that with that imagination and with that thinking that anything is possible, that you're doing positive, you're not causing harm to anybody, and anything is possible, and I totally support that. So that's the goal of the show.
That's wonderful. And how can people tune in, and when will it be ready? So.
No dates yet. I'm still producing. I'm kind of like, not a one-woman show. I have a director of research and an animator and all of that stuff. So no date yet, but we're working on it. So there is a preview on Vimeo, password protected. Let me know if anybody wants to see it. I can give you the password.
All right, you'll have to keep us updated. Yeah. Thank you. All right, now this really makes me optimistic. So, Dr. Lisa, one more question. To keep building on what Aishah-Nyeta just shared about storytelling, parents are often the guardians of stories that we tell children at home and about climate change, especially the younger children. How can parents and caregivers have meaningful conversations with the children about climate change?
So the way that I look at it is I sort of think the ABCs, as it's easier for me to remember and also to communicate it. The first consideration is, what is the age? What is the age of your child? Because you're not going to talk to a really young child the same way you're going to talk to a teenager, obviously, or a middle schooler. And so you calibrate the story and how it shapes up depending upon the age of the child. Then B is the behavior to consider. Is this an indoor kid? Is this a child who loves nature, who is always going out, etc.? Because that will also inform you about how to shape how you speak to your child. Then the other is, the C, is conditions. How has this child been, what has this child been exposed to? Is this child in a frontline community? Does he or she know well what the hazards are? Or is this a child who has essentially lived in a bubble? These are the things that will help you inform how you tell these stories. And what I also say is then I go to the 3 L's, which is listen to your child. What's your child saying? I had the child of a patient who said that he was afraid Charlie, the dog, would die because animal extinction rates, and the mom had to explain what that was all about. So listen to your child. What are your child's concerns? And if you don't know what your child is talking about, or even to validate, which is very important, what your child is talking about, learn about those issues if you don't know. So that is a key element, and let your child know that you're going to, because this is the empowerment that is such a healthy message to them about how they feel about themselves. So listen, learn, and then leverage. So this is where you turn to, here's what we can do about it. If it's a young child, you can say, you know what? Based on what you've told me, why don't we have a family garden? Why don't we have a vegetable garden? Or why don't we go to the school and convince them to get rid of the grass, and we'll just plant a whole bunch of stuff with deep roots that fixes all that dirty stuff in the air. Or you turn to the teenager and say, you know, I'm with you on your Fridays of the future. Do you want me to drive you to the protest? Drop you off? You want me to be there? How do you want me to handle this? Because I support what you're doing. Because this is what, when you're looking at the mental health of these kids who are going to obviously be exposed in increasing frequency and intensity, what we need to do now is make them feel like empowering agents who can act where they see the problem is and where they see they can be most powerful. So that's my sort of 1-2 ABC to parents about talking to kids.
Thank you, Dr. Lisa. Empowering agents, that is certainly something we can all do. And so now I wanted to turn to Dr. Anenberg. And one of the most influential ways for driving solutions is our educational system. And you are the director of the Climate and Health Institute at the Milken School of Public Health, where the intersection of climate change and health is being incorporated into the curriculums there. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you see academic institutions helping us train the next generation to be strong leaders in a changing climate?
Absolutely. Well, the first thing I want to say is that I'm still learning. I just learned the 3 L's, and I'm going to go home and practice that with my kids, so thank you. And, you know, as a undergraduate student, I really was looking for this connection between climate and health in a training program. I was an undergraduate biology and environmental science double major at Northwestern University. I was working overnight shifts at the Evanston Hospital and seeing patients come in and talking to them about their lives and what conditions they're living in. And it just sort of the combination of those things connected with me that the world around us, the climate that we're living in, the air that we're breathing, the water that we're drinking, affects our health. And it may be that we're landing in an emergency room through no fault of our own, but because of the environment that we're living in. So I set off to learn more about the intersection between climate change and health, and come to Washington here and make an impact on policy, and discovered that there really were not programs, training programs in climate and health at the time. So it's now really gratifying for me to be a part of creating those training programs. So at George Washington University, I'm really proud to say that we have a Master of Public Health concentration in climate and health that we just launched. We have a longitudinal track for our medical students at GW to learn about climate change and how to bring that into the clinical setting. And it's really exciting to see, this is something that is training the next leaders in public health, the next leaders of clinicians, to be able to meet the challenges that are coming, that are here now and that are worsening in the future so that they can address them. They have the tools to address them. It's not just GW, of course. There are a lot of other universities, too, that are creating these programs. And I think it's addressing the pent-up demand among the next generation of students that they want to see this. They recognize that the climate change is a problem that is permeating all aspects of public health. You'd be really hard-pressed to find an area of public health that climate change does not touch. The next generation sees that, and they want to be empowered. They want to be trained to address that challenge in the settings that they're going to go off and work in government, non-governmental organizations, community groups, even consulting, working in the healthcare sector. No matter where they're going to be confronted with this challenge, and these training programs are equipping them to be able to develop programs to address the problems.
It's really fantastic. I imagine that that climate and health, the intersection of the two, had not previously been touched on in medical school and maybe other curriculums. So this is something relatively new. Is that true?
It's certainly relatively new, and I think we'll see more programs going forward. Our dean of the School of Public Health at GW co-led a report by the American Schools and Programs of Public Health, just released a few months ago, talking about how to bring climate change into public health training programs. And so we now will have guidelines on how to do this. We have critical competencies that are outlined for other academic programs to be able to bring into their training programs.
That's fantastic. And how might this work also influence curriculums in grade schools, and how do you see that possibly playing out in driving change? Is there a trickle effect, so to speak?
What's incredible is that my kids are already learning about this in their elementary school. I, of course, force my kids to do the science fair every year, and they usually are measuring air quality. But this year, they learned about how to measure air quality in the outdoor air without my even doing it. They learned it from their teacher. So this is now being incorporated into our curriculum, and I think that it's really necessary. So we now have students who are introduced to these topics well before I was, it wasn't until my undergraduate education, as I said, where that really clicked for me, where I had enough exposure to these issues for that to come together. These students now are encountering these topics at earlier ages and are going to be even more prepared to be trained and address the problem.
Thank you. So we have some bonus questions, time for that. And so we'll keep these answers short if you wouldn't mind. And so, Dr. Anenberg, what is inspiring you the most in the climate movement right now?
Well, there's actually a lot. I think we have some hope. We have action being taken at unprecedented scales with our current administration. I think we heard a lot about that today. But I think there's also, I actually want to reflect on some of the things I heard about with the earlier discussions here today, is that a lot of the things that were being highlighted were benefits that people would experience from reducing climate change that really don't have a lot to do with climate change. By putting in place climate solutions, there are a lot of other benefits that we get as parents, that our children would get, business owners would get. And I think there's ever increasing recognition that climate solutions are solutions for multiple problems. And so no matter what you think about the climate change issue, how much you think we need to address it, some of these actions, most of them, are good to do for improving air quality today, are good to do for improving physical fitness, are good to do for improving mental health. There's really quite a range of additional benefits that would come along with that.
Great answer. There are certainly many different benefits from reducing the effects of air pollution and climate change. So Aishah-Nyeta, I wanted to ask you, can you tell us about your own personal journey to this environmental work, how you got here? And was there a moment you realized you wanted to do this?
Yes, so I do have a story about that. So when I was about 17 years old, I got a really cool, unique opportunity to study geospatial technologies in South Africa at the University of Pretoria. And we had like sort of this place off campus where we stayed that was like, I don't know what it's called, but there's like different like houses and it's sort of like its own like facility. And we would take a bus to the university every day and go into the classrooms and things like that. And I grew up an artist, around artists and music and things like that. And I had always been very interested in nature and sort of the climate crisis was sort of bubbling. It was a topic that was being discussed for a couple of years prior, and I had some interest in it, which is obviously why I applied for such a program. And I remember one of the professors who was riding with us on the bus was like, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I was like, you know, I really like this stuff, but I'm an artist, so I would really love to combine the two. And at the time, like this, like 10 years ago, so like at the time, that was kind of a weird thing to say out loud. But that's sort of, I kind of hyper-focused on that, and I was like, there's gotta be a way that I can make this work, combining the creative sector with the climate sector, and I just focused and sort of carved my own path and then found different opportunities along the way and found Good Energy, which is literally perfect. It's literally climate creative people. And so, yeah, that's sort of how my journey happened, was having two things that I was really, really passionate about and knowing that I wasn't gonna give up on either one of them and finding a way from there. Again, I think hope and imagination are more powerful than people give them credit for, and really, truly, yeah.
That's wonderful. So glad that you've married the two together, because we all benefit from all of the information, the storytelling that you are doing. So, and it leads the way for the younger generation too to understand how to do that. So thank you. And then Dr. Lisa, can you tell us about what do you hope future generations will say about this moment in time 50 years from now?
Well, we all know that we want this story to have a happy ending, but I wouldn't be true to my professional experiences if I didn't start off by saying a word of warning. And that is that democracy is not a default form of government. And one of my concerns, before I get to the more positive aspect, is that when people are afraid, they regress. And they will be sometimes ready to exchange cherished values for the promise of security, especially from people that they don't know well and they can scapegoat, or from forces, et cetera. And these promises can come from, as we know, tyrants, strong men, et cetera. And then we have forms of government which are not democratic at all. And I used to be a profiler for the executive branch of world leaders. So I know these forces are afoot right now, and I know that we're in treacherous waters. So it is really important for us, and it's been mentioned several times, that we understand how to talk to each other across the barriers. And that is one thing that we can do across a kitchen table, and it does reinforce that we need to vote and that we need to become active in the political sphere, because right now that's where the current is taking us, especially in these next few months. So what do I hope for the future? Just as we know there are climate tipping points, and boy, this scares me too. I have a book coming out, Climate in Your Mind, which is also online, free, just like EcoSci is. And I talk about climate tipping points because what happens is we can sometimes, the genie is out of the bottle, and it's hard to stuff it back in. So we are in places now where we're accelerating the impacts of air pollution and climate change. But this is the point. Just as there are climate tipping points and they're scary, There are social tipping points. And what we see here today, in the 1.5 million moms and all the people listening right now, all the people taking this in, is that we are reaching a place. It doesn't have to be everybody. Social tipping points occur when a certain number of people feel the social norm has changed, and they pick up on behaviors not because they've been told or browbeaten or anything else, but it's because everybody else is doing it. This is the power of social norms, and this is what this group does. So that's what I'm hoping will be said, was that this was part of the reason that we have the social tipping points that changed the world.
Thank you, Dr. Lisa. And we're nearly out of time, so I want to wrap up by sharing another solution in our toolbox, which is the U.S. Early Years Climate Action Plan. And over the past year, moms participated in the Early Years Climate Action Task Force, and they drafted a first ever U.S. Early Years Climate Action Plan. And what this does is it offers a robust menu of policy solutions for how the country can help young children thrive in a changing climate. And attendees can find a link to the report in their program. So I'd love to thank all of our panelists for joining us today, and appreciate all the knowledge and the time that you've spent with us, and also the opportunities for solutions to build a better and healthier future. So thank you all. Okay. All right, let's get started again. It is my profound honor, and it gives me great joy to welcome to the stage Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Michael Regan.
He has been a passionate advocate for environmental justice and has put children and young people's concerns at the heart of his work. I won't go into detail on Administrator Regan's biography because I feel sure that one day we will be reading biographies of him. He grew up in North Carolina, graduated from the North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, making him the first EPA administrator to have matriculated from a historically Black college. He has a master's in public administration from George Washington University. Prior to his appointment at EPA, Regan served as the secretary of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. And one of my favorite details, fresh out of college, the administrator started his illustrious career as an intern at EPA. Administrator Regan has put the spotlight on environmental racism. He's also inaugurated a youth advisory council in order to better hear the concerns of young people. Administrator Regan hears and he listens and he acts. His moral compass is strong. He is an inspiration to so many of us. He knows and feels very deeply how much more there is to do and how urgent is the need to get things done. All of us who care about clean air and toxic chemicals intend to act with urgency to get vitally significant EPA protections coming up across the finish line. Administrator Regan.
It is such an honor to meet you and to have this conversation, the first Black man to run the Environmental Protection Agency and a dad. So this is not just your day job, right? This is a passion and this is very personal for you. Last year, the EPA released a report on children's health and climate change. And as we've heard today and talked about numerous times, kids are uniquely vulnerable to the effects of climate disruption. And I know that the EPA's mission is to protect the environment and human health. What do you see as your responsibility to children of today and the generations to come?
Yes, well, thank you for the question, and Dominique, thank you for that wonderful introduction. If I could start every day like that, that would be wonderful. This is deeply personal for me. Every morning when I leave the house, I'm kissing my 10-year-old son on the forehead and hoping to be the best dad and the best administrator that I can for him and, as he says, for his colleagues. It's a labor of love, and I'm also proud as EP administrator to, within our agency, have the Office of Children's Health, which is one of the only federal offices that is solely focused on children's environmental health. And so we know that children are the future, and it is so important that we lead with public health for our most vulnerable. And when we talk about environmental justice and equity and we talk about disproportionate impacts, typically we do think about low income and Black and brown people, but some of our most vulnerable people to environmental pollution are our children. And so every day, every morning I wake up and think about whether it's engaging with Congress or people who disagree or some of these tough, challenging issues. I do it with a smile because I'm thinking about my son, Matthew, and his colleagues.
Yes, and I hope you're thinking about my daughters as well. I know you are, as a mom to a 9 and 11-year-old, so I understand having that mission. So let's talk headlines. The EPA sets the standards for how much soot pollution is allowed into the air, and I know that we all heard and we're very excited to hear that you recently tightened that standard. How do you anticipate that improving the air quality and also the health outcomes for children?
It's an absolute game changer. I have to credit the president with charging us to be vigilant and laser focused on public health. Growing up, I experienced respiratory challenges, and it's really not fun when you're on your way to school and you're having trouble breathing and you're trying to think about normal things that kids think about and the pressures of learning. And so when we think about tightening this soot rule and the possibility that when this rule is fully implemented, over 800,000 asthma cases, symptoms avoided, that's a lot of children. Those children will not only feel better physically, but that's one thing we're taking off their plates to deal with as they go to school, as they try to learn, as they try to compete and be good colleagues to one another. And so it's a privilege and an honor to be able to fight in a way where you have numbers like 800,000 or preventing 4,500 premature deaths, or thinking about all the lost work days and school days. This rule is years in the making. And by the way, EPA did not do it alone. Moms Clean Air Force, Environmental Defense Fund, so many organizations have rallied around us to give us the ability and the protection politically and substantively to pursue tightening these standards. So I'm grateful, and it's an honor. And Matthew is grateful too.
Well, I also have asthma and grew up in an urban environment, so I'm grateful as well. And when you say this was years in the making, we also know that it's been a decade since that standard has been changed, so definitely a step in the right direction. So we know that 22% of the US population is below the age of 18, and boy, they're ready to be heard. They are, we saw Lena get up on the stage. So from lawsuits that we've heard about, like the one in Montana, to social media movements, they want to put their voices out there. How is the EPA ensuring that young people have their voices heard when it comes to policy decisions and when whatever happens today is really impacting the course of their lives?
I can assure all of you that we are listening. As a matter of fact, you're right. Young people are not willing to wait. They want to be heard. Lena introduced me yesterday, and when I indicated that she was somewhat a local celebrity at EPA, and I think she wants my job, she didn't deny that. Let's be clear, they are very aggressive.
An internship, perhaps.
I've been to over 38 states and over 13 countries in the last 3 years. And in each state, in each country, we've hosted youth roundtables. We've engaged young people. And we have extracted so many good ideas. And whether it's urban or rural or elementary or high school, we at EPA felt that we needed to formalize our engagements. And so we created the National Youth Environmental Advisory Council, a federal FACA, where we will convene young people ages 16 to 29 periodically to give me advice on specific policies and regulations, and then I can turn around and offer those ideas to the president. Every major social movement in this country has been led by young people, and this environmental movement is no different. And so we want to harness that power and that energy and those ideas, and we're trying our best to do that throughout our travels, but also in a more formalized way.
How are you turning those ideas into action? Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. I think that engaging our young people, let's just say influencers. There are a lot of times as bureaucrats, we are going through our process and we're thinking about what the proper numbers and standards should be. And some of us can be very conservative. But when you engage young people and some of the influencers and they, through social media, apply the appropriate pressure through a different lens, it forces not only for those of us at the political level, but our staffs to think about it differently and be a little bit more adventurous in how we, or creative in how we justify some of the decisions that we make. So I think that we've engaged young people through policy making from, hey, put pressure on us. We're gonna listen to you, and don't just share your ideas directly. Put public pressure on all of us to force us to perform at the highest levels. That's just one example of ways that we hope to engage our young people. This National Youth Advisory Council, instead of having an agenda for them, the first meeting will be developing a prioritized list of what they want to focus on in their meeting with the administrator of EPA. So we have to continue to give young people power. We have to continue to engage and not be afraid of not having all the answers, or maybe falling short of some of the things that they're asking us to do in the near term.
It's so empowering to give young people agency. They don't vote, right? But knowing that they have agency over their lives and can make a difference, and it's really great to see that you've really taken the time to hear them and evolve that into action. Young people of color and marginalized communities, as we've heard today, we talked a lot about environmental racism, but they're disproportionately exposed to the severest impacts of climate disruption. How is the EPA working to make sure that children, overburdened children, can grow up in a safe environment when even the thought of playing outdoors, which is such an essential part of childhood, can pose a risk?
You know, I think we think about that through a few lenses. The first is education. We know that Black and brown children are disproportionately impacted by pollution, but also suffer at a disproportionate level with respiratory illnesses and other challenges. And I think that helping to educate our parents on when there is a high ozone action day, or when there's a wildfire in close proximity, we have technologies and tools and apps that inform parents. Your child doesn't have to sit out of soccer season, but there may be certain days and certain games where certain things are happening where we want to keep them safer. I think the president's direction to me that we will remove 100% of the lead pipes in this country is a perfect example of understanding that Black and brown children are disproportionately exposed to lead service lines, and we know what that can do. There is no acceptable level of lead, and we understand what those impacts mean to a child's ability to learn and function and perform in society. And so as we tackle pollution and as we tackle the climate crisis, I firmly believe that we can do it while prioritizing those who are disproportionately impacted, but not at their expense. And I think that as we have mature conversations about what pollution we prioritize and what technologies we pursue and how we do it, it is very important that children, minority children, environmental justice communities have a big seat at the table.
That's wonderful to hear. So we talked a little bit about you being a dad to Matthew. And you know, we really do think of all kids as our children, right? Yes. Can you tell us how the environmental hazards that we're talking about today and that are out there, how they intersect with your life, excuse me, as a dad? And how your role has really shifted the way you see parenting and being a father?
Well, personally, I will say I am married to one of the strongest women I've ever met, and to see the impact my son has on her is profound. Now, as the administrator, if she were brushing her teeth and the water was running and I said, hey, don't let the water run, you're wasting water, I might not have dinner. When Matthew says, Mom, you're wasting valuable water, the light bulb. Mom, Dad, turn off the lights. You're wasting electricity. Those coal-fired power plants are running and we don't need it. The influence, here's another secret, right? I also know that the way to an adult's heart is through children. And we can all have our opinions, but most people want to do what is most protective of their children. If we strategically engage and give our children a voice, the same impact I am seeing in my household, and I profess to be up on environmental stewardship, is the same impact we will see all across the country. We should not allow for clean air and clean water to be political. Every child in this country, every person in this country deserves access to clean air and clean water. The best messengers for that are our children. And so when I think about being afforded the opportunity to go and sit, as the kids say, crisscross applesauce at my child's school and talk to 30 or 40 of his colleagues. And some of them, when I say, how many in this crowd have asthma, and they all pull out their inhalers and hold them up in the air, and then we talk to them about how we're trying to reduce their asthmatic symptoms, it's very powerful. And you see that not only with the children, but with the teachers and with the janitors and every adult that's in that room. That's the kind of impact we want to have on this discourse of protecting our children.
And when we think about kids, kids are more capable than we realize, and they're so smart and switched on. So it's nice to be able to have that focus group of Matthew and his colleagues. For many people, the world of environmental policymaking can seem really out of reach. What advice would you give the people here in this room and those watching the live stream on how to get involved in supporting policies that are going to make the planet safer and healthier for all kids?
I think it's actually easier now than ever before for parents and for people to get involved. Before, you would have to maybe Google or find some hotline or call the EPA and speak to some person. Now, through social media, everyone can communicate about everything. And there are some topics that probably aren't worth communicating about, and there are some topics that are definitely worth communicating about. And I think that parents learning from Mom's Clean Air Force and other organizations about how to use their voice, it is so much easier now to use your voice. And we all are influenced by social media and the numbers and the likes and the impressions that we get when a topic is introduced and we see who's behind those numbers. I would just say that if you are a parent, clean air and clean water should be a no-brainer. And if you believe that, make your voices heard through social media, through your churches, through your local organizations, because this administration is listening to all of those mediums.
So let's rewire the algorithm. So we were talking about that.
Yes.
And get climate disruption on there so that we can spread the word. Now, February is Black History Month, and as I mentioned before, you are the first Black man to lead the EPA, and so many people look up to you and see you as a role model. What does Black History Month mean to you personally, and what do you hope will be possible for Black environmental leaders in the future?
Yes, it's an honor to be in this position. I just returned back from a trip to Mozambique and Ghana, and in Ghana had the opportunity to visit Cape Coast and to see, ground zero for where a lot of the atrocities of the slave trade began and continued for hundreds of years. And as part of the diaspora, when I think about the strength of those of African heritage and the shoulders that I stand on for hundreds of years, what people have endured and survived, to be afforded the opportunity as a Black man to sit in the president's cabinet and give the leader of the free world advice about how we protect our children, I have to pinch myself. But I also do it with such a level of confidence because I have a perspective that not many before me have had, which is we can protect all people. And we can ensure that as we protect all people, those who happen to look like me, who are disproportionately impacted, will get a seat at the table. And under President Biden's leadership, we're getting it more right than we ever have. And so it's a huge honor. It's a huge opportunity. But I never really make it about me. I make it about the opportunity. And I hope that the little brown kid that has asthma like I did will understand that there is someone sitting in this chair that's not only fighting for him, but again, as Matthew says, for all of his colleagues.
Thank you so much for your leadership and for bringing that very valuable perspective, and not only as a Black man, but like as a father,
Yes.
and really putting your heart in everything you do. We are very appreciative.
Thank you so much. It's an honor.
Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. I have learned a great deal. I hope you have, including, I think, my all-time favorite line, air is the most popular thing in the world. I hope you've come away as inspired as I am, that you made new connections, found new sources for information, and heard new angles on the challenges and solutions we face. I certainly have. An enormous thank you to all the people at Moms Clean Air Force who made this event happen. Thank you so much. Please join us at Moms Clean Air Force. Sign up at the website, get our fact sheets, our petitions. Join us when we meet with legislators and testify before EPA and Congress. Progress can be slow, painstaking. The opposition is strong and actually getting stronger. We have learned in doing our advocacy that one of the most important things is simply to show up every single day, every month, every year, for decades, if necessary. Never, ever give up. Thank you so much for showing up with us today.